Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Y'all happy to be here? Yeah. So happy to have these two brilliant, talented writers with us today. Welcome Michael Datcher and Esmeralda Santiago. So our program today is, what do we call it? These two authors discuss their compelling and tragic historical fictions. Set in the turbulent eras of the U.S. and Puerto Rico, their stories ring familiar with passions that change lives and cultural brutalities that define racism and classism, running as rampant in the past as today. With twin brothers in both stories, there's twice as much havoc in families caught up in their lives and loves. So we're going to begin with just a couple of short readings, and then we'll go to the panel, and then in the end we'll have a little time hopefully for some Q&A. Sound good? Okay, so you want to go first?
I'll start. Thanks for coming to this really beautiful book festival here in Brooklyn and making time to come and see us. This book, Americus, is a novel about when families have an issue that they can't solve and how that impacts the family's relationships along the way between children, between the parents. In this particular story, the youngest son of a set of twins contracts vitiligo, the so-called, in pop culture, the Michael Jackson disease. It makes people who are black or brown lose their pigmentation in splotches. He's 10 years old when this particular issue happens to him. And this really has a powerful impact on the family as the family moves forward. The book is also a meditation on the impact of violence in America, and the intersection of race and violence. As we know, in our country, in our culture, violence is entertainment. If you look at our video game play, from Grand Theft Auto to Halo 3, or our pop culture TV shows or movies, we get entertained by people getting shot the hell up, chopped the hell up, blanked the hell up. And so I wondered about the impact of this on children, so that plays a role in this particular upcoming passage. The boys are on an adventure right now to go find their birthday gifts that were buried by their father, and they stop by the local meatpacking company in East St. Louis where the book is set. It's set in 1917 in a town about 13 miles from Ferguson, which has a long history, as we know, of racialized violence. And with that, I will start reading. Again, thank you for being here. The youngest son is set. He's born 7 minutes after his oldest brother. It was still early in the yards. Workers entering through the main gate walked straight towards the huge building with Armour and Company across the top. The outdoor pens were mostly unmanned. I guess it doesn't take too many men to watch over sheep since they've got their own big old eyes, Set said. Asar was quiet, tense. Maybe we should pet one, Set said, smiling. Asar's body jerked towards his brother. No, Set. You are more scaredy than these stinky, inky sheep, and they're about to get killed, Set said, drawing his forefinger across his throat. No one's even watching us. If you climb that fence, I swear to God, I will sock you right in the behind. I'm not gonna climb it, Mr. Scaredy Cat. I'm just gonna stick my hand through and pet one. Before Asar could come up with a good reply, Set stuck his whole arm into the pen and began doing his sheep call. Sheep. Asar looked quickly left, right, then behind himself. To his relief, a young sheep about 5 feet from the fence stayed there. These sheep don't speak English, stupid. You don't know which of those gibberish languages they understand, Asar said. Set ignored his brother. He stuck his other arm through and wiggled his fingers and added his best imitation of a Polish accent. Sheep, ski. Horrified, Asar began looking around to see if anyone, the lamb looked right at Set and bleated again, then started to cautiously move towards him. Set poured on the Polish ski. Horrified, Asar began looking around to see if anyone was watching them. Cut it out, Set. Sheep. The baby Polish sheep again bleated and came within petting distance. Set lunged forward, grabbed the startled lamb by the throat with both hands and squeezed as hard as he could. The sheep bucked But Set snatched him closer into the sheep's wild eyes were inches from his own. In one quick motion, Set released his left hand just long enough to forcefully jab his left forefinger through the soft flesh adjacent to the lamb's eye and yanked the bulging oval right out of its socket. The bleating, hysterical sheep broke free of Set's grip and wildly zigzagged like a puffy bronco, big eyeball flopping from its optical cord, a crazed stare on a string. Set's eyes grew large too. She-e-e-e-p. The bleating bronco started a bleating contest among the other sheep. This collective animal wail reverberated inside Asar's skull as he stared at Set, who was staring at the traumatized you. Asar watched Set's excitement at creating chaos and pain again. In these moments, Asar felt a kind of fear. He wasn't afraid of his brother. Asar was afraid that he and his brother were only twins on the outside.
Wonderful. I'm reading from Conquistadora, my most recent but long ago book. And it takes place in Puerto Rico in the mid-19th century. This particular section that I'm going to be reading from takes place on April 21st, 1865. And the only thing, I think you probably understand who the people are. Over then the lights around the mill, the valley was an expanse of impenetrable darkness. The landscape was black and flat as a tabletop, but from Ana's perch at El Destino, with the forested mountains to the north and east, the valley appeared like the bottom of a dark bowl about to spill its contents into the Caribbean Sea. Disculpe, Doña Ana, Mary came to the balcón. Shall we serve your dinner? No, I'll wait until my husband comes home. That's just it, señora. A boy came to let you know that El Patron is not coming. He sent this message. Mary handed Ana a scrap torn from the ledgers where the foreman kept track of the laborers' hours. It was folded several times, and inside the writing was scribbled in a hurry. American president murdered. Guards will be out all night. Ana had to sit down. Is something wrong, señora? Ana shook her head, but her mind was racing. News traveled quickly through the slave barracks. Certainly, Lincoln's assassination had probably reached El Destino's workers before Severo's message reached her. Ana was suddenly aware that the vast house behind her was strangely empty. Where is everybody? They're all eating in the back, señora. Just then, an enormous tongue of flame rose into the sky over Finca San Bernabé. Ana jumped from her rocker and leaned over the railing as if to fly over it. What is it? Mary instinctively reached to keep Ana from falling. Fire in San Bernabé. They set fire to the cane all the time, señora. I know the difference between a controlled burn and that. Ana pointed to the flames, growing and spreading quickly. San Bernabé is a farm, not Cañaveral. Conciencia appeared. Señora, I see it, Conciencia. The three women stood on the balcón, watching the flames weave and dance in sparkling bursts of yellow, red, orange, blue. It won't burn for long, Mary said. It rained this afternoon. Not there, Conciencia said. They watched for some time as the blaze spread. Ana pointed her telescope in its direction. It's completely out of control. No bell, Conciencia noted, and it was true. Even from here, they should have heard a warning to the neighbors about the fire and calls for help. Ana scanned the night. On the boundary of Los Gemelos and San Bernabé, erratic lights moved like fireflies in the evening. Torches. Someone is setting fire to our cane. As if her words were action, flames peaked over the valley in tall red and yellow flashes. The torches went in several directions at once, regrouped, and another fire started further east. There was nothing she could do except turn her telescope toward the mill, as if finding Severo among the movement of beasts, men, and equipment would warn him that several fields away the cane was on fire. When she first looked, there was nothing out of the ordinary near the beast-powered Trapiche Chico, nor by the larger steam-powered Trapiche Grande. But suddenly, the bell changed its insistent, unmistakable warning. Someone had seen the fire. The sound changed everything. Have them saddle my horse, Ana ordered, and Conciencia flew inside, calling for Theo. You're not going down there, señora, Mary was shaking. Of course I must, Ana said. There will be injuries, burns. I have to take care of them. Ay, señora, I should have told you. Ana stopped in her tracks. Told me what? Jacobo was talking about, lo puedo decir? Rebellion. I heard him, señora, and he also said the words, independence, war against the Españoles. I told him not to. Our Jacobo? Yes, that Jacobo, the man who fought the Blanco when I was burned. Ana looked toward San Bernabé, then at the burning cane brakes. She hadn't considered that whoever was setting the cane on fire could be one of her people. Her knees felt slack, but she wouldn't show it, not especially to this girl whom she'd grasped from death's fingers, whom she felt owed her, yes, owed her life. Are you telling the truth, Mary? Do you know of others? I only heard Jacobo say those words. When? A long time ago, before Segundo was born. I should have told you then, but yes, you should have. Do I get my freedom, señora? The law says that if I tell, I get my papers.
Great, thank you guys so much. Okay, so I wanted to start with Esmeralda, a quote from, one of my favorite quotes from this novel. History was both personal and universal, and Ana was conscious that it swirled inexorably whether people paid attention to it or not. So my question is along those lines for both of you. To the extent that past is prologue, how the historical periods, at least that you're most familiar with now, shape what you'd call the dynamics of today, either for Puerto Rico or America, and start with you, Esmeralda?
Well, I'm very aware of the fact that what's happening in Puerto Rico now has been happening for 500 years, and we don't really hear about it. We are born Americans, we are American citizens, and yet our history is not taught in the United States. People don't know who we are. And I began with that question, why don't people know about Puerto Rico? Well, one of the reasons was that even people like me who read a lot hadn't really studied it. And I wanted to learn more about it and to find out where my ancestors were when these things happen, when El Grito de Lares happens. Where were they? And I began reading the history for my own information. And as I read the history of Puerto Rico, these characters begin to emerge. Of course, you know, if you're a writer, everything you read eventually makes it into your writing. And before I knew it, I was creating a world based on the information that I was learning, but also in what I knew, because I had a 19th century upbringing. I lived in a little barrio with no electricity, no running water. We were barefoot. It was a very rural part of Puerto Rico, and we didn't have the contact with anybody else except the people there. So it really brought me, it was both revisiting that childhood, but also realizing just how little had changed in everything, in the way people lived, in the same struggles that are happening in the legislatures. The same kinds of things were happening, and the only thing that has changed in Puerto Rico is that now, you know, it's much more Americanized because of the American influence there, but also the fact that we're able to come back and forth and we bring information. And that illiteracy went from 85% in 1898 to, you know, about 100% literacy now. But, you know, almost everything else, the politics are the same, a lot of the same issues are the same, racism still exists, even though we pretend it isn't. All these kinds of things are still there, and I hope that by bringing it forward, things will make a shift, both here and there.
Great. I actually wanted to just point out, in terms of Michael's book, it is set like just a few miles from Ferguson, and there's a lot of I don't know, maybe foresight on your part or just understanding. Is there something about that area even that exemplifies the intersection of race and violence in America?
Yes, it's East St. Louis is about 13 miles from Ferguson, and that particular region has a very long and troubling history of racialized violence. The nation's worst race riot, even until today, was the East St. Louis 1970 East St. Louis race riot, in which the estimates vary, but at least 250 people were killed in that race riot. It was caused by economic competition between blacks coming into the town from the South trying to find jobs to support their families, and the whites who were living there at the time, who were immigrants for the most part. So the novel was really my attempt to talk about what happens when a part of the country doesn't deal with its racialized issues, how those things, if they aren't resolved in some way, they have a way of continuing on. So this book began, in terms of the writing of it, about 9 years ago now. And so when Ferguson jumped off most recently, I wasn't surprised. I was very troubled to see the level of intensity in that particular altercation. But it lets you know that if we don't deal with our issues in a very thorough, humane, and loving way, they will not go away. They'll be on pause, like our iPhone sometimes, but then they'll come back, and 40 years later or 35 years later. And so the book for me is really a meditation, actually, on violence and race in America.
Wondering what it was, writing historical novel history it's pretty long. What maybe specifically drew you to the period that you chose as opposed to some other period? Esmeralda?
Well, for me, the period chose me. I'd written 3 memoirs and a contemporary novel, and it really emerged from my curiosity about my own ancestors. That I started. Because I'm a memoir writer, of course, I'm constantly talking to my parents and families, and just, especially with my elderly parents, trying to get information because it's going to go with them. And I learned that both grandparents were illiterate, so we don't have journals. I don't have a history other than that. And so I began to read it from that perspective, and then it really was a situation where I began to see visually what was happening. I was just on my walks. I live in the country up here, and I'd be walking, and I would really literally have a vision of somebody on a horse, which I'm terrified of, by the way. And it was the history said to me, it needs to be written. And it sounds weird and, New Age and all that stuff, but that's really what it felt. It felt that I needed to do it. I needed to do it for me, and I needed to do it for Puerto Rico, and I needed to do it for Puerto Ricanos because not even there it hasn't been done. So it was this kind of, I came of age in the 60s, and you try to fix things all the time, and I think that's where that emerged, and now I live in the 19th century. I might be here with you, but I really am not.
I thought that was a 19th century Kindle that you had there.
Nice. I had the same thought myself. Wow.
Same question. What about the specific time period drew you in, you felt needed to be written about?
Well, this race riot of 1917 is not a well-known. By a show of hands, who's heard about the East St. Louis 1917 race riot? By a show of hands. 5 of us. It is the nation's worst and probably most complicated. So I wanted to, through historical fiction, bring to light the complications in these relationships. Because for me, history when it's fiction especially, is a repository for possibilities. If we can learn through historical fiction, for example, how to identify new ways of going forward, new solutions, we should use those for the current day. So I wanted to explore this race riot by discussing a family's rise from poverty, through slavery, into the modern era, and look at how race and violence shaped that particular family, but how they also try to find a way to survive it and become whole and well as a result of it. So part of my concern and intention was to talk about the full, rich humanity of black folk, oftentimes walking through the planet in a racialized black body, if I walk into a room as a black man with dreadlocks, although I'm fly, I still get stares and people following me, and it's very complicated walking through life with black skin covering your body. It's super complicated. Every day you're making literally 30, 40 decisions around how to engage people. And so that can make you crazy if you're unhealthy, if you don't meditate, pray, call upon Jesus or somebody. And so I wanted to explore how people deal with that particular phenomena of being alive in a black body, but trying to be healthy, trying to be in love, trying to raise kids. And this period, this race riot, offered a chance to really explore when things go wrong and when things can go right.
So it's a very interesting contrast in these two books. There's a lot of similarities, but one interesting difference is that Esmeralda, the title character, was actually a slaveholder as opposed to somebody who's on the other end, and I found that very intriguing. And I think it speaks to, we have a hard time knowing what to do with the sort of collective injustices that shape, the new world. And no one wants to own the slave-holding ancestry, right? I mean, it's we want to identify with the victim side. But was that a challenge to take on, and were you ever concerned about maybe, challenging the sort of the villainous? She's a very human character, Anna. Were you concerned about taking on this villainous impression of the slave owner?
I wanted people to understand that as horrible as these people were, they were human just like us, and so I wanted my mother's people, and I've now recently finally started going through the ancestry stuff. They were all white. All on my mother's side, I keep anything that I find blanco, blanco, blanco. I go on my father's side, everything's negro, negro, negro. And so I really wanted to be able to see both sides of me and both sides of Puerto Rican history, because the Puerto Rican history has been written by white people because of the huge amount of illiteracy there. And the only people who could afford to be educated were the elite and mostly white. So I really didn't choose Anna so much as she chose me. I really had this very strong image of this young woman wanting to go to the new world, to be a conquistadora. She really had that idea, but not thinking what it meant, that once she gets to Puerto Rico, she's a slaveholder, that she hadn't made that step. And so all of a sudden she has to deal with that situation. And she comes with, she has two husbands. The first husband, they just said, oh, great, I can fuck anybody here, And the other guy, that when he's gone, the second husband that she marries, he's the slave master. And so she has to make she really has to decide, who am I? And so she decides, she doesn't say, I'm going to free them all. She could have. She was a rich lady. She could have done that. But what she said is, I'm going to take care of them. I'm going to make sure they're healthy. I'm going to make sure that their places are clean, and I was kind of envisioning, if I were in that situation, that's I would want to take care of them. I would want to do that. So that's where that came. She really constantly talked to me in terms of every time I sit down to write and I wanted to write about something else, it was always her point of view until Severo, her second husband, one day just kind of appeared, and I realized I have to, even in that situation of the two white slave masters, I have to look at both sides. The one who takes care of them, who actually touches them, because she nurses them when they get sick, and the one who whips them. And, it wasn't fun. There were moments where, there were many sleepless nights, and there was a lot of crying and a lot of anger and a lot of throwing things around and just feeling, just the unfairness of it, but at the same time feeling this incredible responsibility to speak about both sides of it. And in Conquistadora, you hear from the slaves, you hear from all the other, everyone around the hacienda. I try to give them all a voice, but those were the hardest ones for me. It was challenging because I'm not a violent person by nature, and all of a sudden I had to envision things that I just would have gone like this in any other situation.
Yeah, I found just just wanted to add just one fascinating item from the character, how do you say, Severo?
Severo.
One point he's trying to figure out who's going to inherit his, the hacienda. And he is going through all the boys that he's whelped on slaves, and he has 30 to choose from. And they've attributed to their slave parents, even though they're his children. And then if he was going to legitimize one, then they would let him call him father. That's 30 boys. And just to think about how little we know about our actual ancestry, right? And that just really stood out as a powerful item about how much almost engineering of our genetic history and that went on in that period. And it does actually kind of segue to, well, did you want to pick up a slightly different take to ask you?
I was really moved by the idea of representing people who act poorly in ways that are human. Even for us in this room tonight or this afternoon, we have folks in our families who do not act right. And when it's our family, when it's our cousin, our auntie who makes a poor choice to touch one of our children inappropriately, who beats up our mother or who attacks our father, we have to deal with that in our own families. We can't always just call the police. We beat them up sometimes. We get violent sometimes with them. We find some creative way to deal with monsters in our families. So I love that you found a creative way to deal with people who are not acting right and not make them these monsters, because that isn't real, as we know in our own lives. And this book tries to do the same thing, which is why I wanted to comment on that. And the youngest son, Seth, who gets vitiligo, you have to imagine when you're 10 years old how hard school is. If you have acne or some problem, but imagine your face, you're a dark-skinned black person, your face is splotching up with white spots. Imagine you're self-conscious. Imagine you're subconscious. Imagine how you would be trying to love yourself when people are always pointing at you. And over a period of years, this young boy, who was a very charismatic and fun, lighthearted kid, like many kids are, begins to turn. And he engages in really terrible acts in this book, because I wanted to talk about how someone becomes a monster. This book is a retelling of the ancient Egyptian narrative of Asar and Set, who were Egyptian gods in the pantheon of Egypt. The Greeks called them Osiris. It's their story brought to East St. Louis in 1917. So Set is the precursor in the Bible to Seta, who we know as Satan. His color was red, he was called the great deceiver, etc. So I wanted to write about the devil, or as Mick Jagger would say, give sympathy for the devil. And this book attempts to humanize people who do really, really bad things, because in our families, we have those people.
I think if we have to humanize them, because if they're all only bad, you can dismiss it.
Right.
I would never do that.
Right.
Well,
and it'll never happen now.
Right.
We're all good people now.
We're good. We're all good right here. No one's bad right now.
Yeah. Actually, building on that, about the vitiligo, there's a point when when Seth's experiencing this happen, where there's a passage where he thinks, he's thinking maybe I'm turning white, right, at one point, and he thinks maybe I'm not turning white, maybe I'm becoming a real American. So that was a really profound moment. What were you thinking? Is he right? What is a real American, and how is that vitiligo maybe a representation?
Yeah, again, this book is an historical novel, but I'm really writing about now. I mean, trying to, through fiction, find creative ways to tackle issues of today. If you write about the current modern context at times, people are very defensive. And so I find that through the distance of time, we can be more open to a more nuanced way to think about race and politics and violence. And so as we know right now, there's a discourse around immigration, who's a real American, in terms of political parties, in terms of race, et cetera. So I wanted to engage in that conversation, but not in an obvious way. And so at one point, Seth is talking about his vitiligo spreading over his body. And he wonders, at what point do I become white or real American? Is it at the 3/5 level, the 2/3 level? And so the book is not meant to really answer that inquiry, but it's meant to have us think about in our own lives, what does it mean to be an American?
Yeah, and it's interesting to use that terminology. We talk about race as a social construction. It's also, at least was a legal construct. There were laws about how racially, proportional you were, and it just seems fitting to be in this room to talk about a legal history of our country and these issues. I'm curious about, that there are very distinct trajectories and histories for Puerto Ricans, Black Americans, just like everybody has their own history. But there seems to be this sort of, as Americans say, we think in terms of there's white and people of color. And even in sort of an event like this, there's a lot in common in you guys' books, but there's a conflation, right, of the Black American experience and people of color experience. And do you feel that in and even terminology of people of POC, people of color, is almost like, hey, just you guys. Right? Do you feel that the attitudes of today kind of conflate your histories and experiences?
Whenever I remember being in school, and everybody was white in history. I mean, I came to the United States, I was 13, so I had already had some history in Puerto Rico, and the people in Puerto Rico were many different shades, right? And the people in the history were very different shades, and because my mother was white and my father was Black, it was very, it wasn't unusual or hard for me. But then I come to the United States, everybody was white except for the slaves. It's like everybody in the history was white. There was not a single story about a Black person, and that was upsetting to me. I spent a lot of time in libraries just looking for where is that other side of me, the other side of, really, we're all Americans in this hemisphere, by the way. This is a hemisphere, it's not a country. And so we're all, we all share that. And so I think when I married a man of Russian descent, and I have children who call themselves Joralemons, I had to really think about, what is it? How do I explain this? When my family comes over and his family comes over, how to help them to understand what was going on? Because in the United States, that was an issue. In Puerto Rico, that's not an issue. I am the eldest of 11, and you look at pictures of my family, and you see the entire range of color, looking Asian, looking curly hair, straight hair, red hair, And so for me, it was a big shock being in the United States and being aware of race in such a powerful, ever-present, every day, every moment issue that I hadn't really had to deal with in Puerto Rico in the same way. And not to say that there isn't racism there is, but it was just different, the way it was done.
Puerto Rican people sometimes say, well, I have students that say, oh, I'm not Black, I'm Puerto Rican, or I'm not Black, I'm Dominican. It's like,
because I think Puerto Ricans want to identify with the place. It's not that we don't want to be Black, is that we want people to know we're from Puerto Rico. That's really important. To Puerto Ricans, that little island that is forgotten is very, very important to us. I don't think Nebraskans feel the same connection to Nebraska as Puerto Ricans
I
feel
don't
to
know.
maybe not.
I don't know.
Well, but I never hear a North American estadounidense saying, I am, Mississippian, unless you drag
You
it
gotta
out
go to
of them.
Mississippi.
A Puerto
Trust me.
Rican will tell it to you in the first 3 minutes,
Yeah. No, those characters, I've certainly met them, but they don't leave Mississippi. That's why they're hard to find. They don't come to New York. They're there. Michael, do you feel that there's a kind of, I think especially for Black Americans, there's a very specific historical experience. And when we use sort of terminology like people of color, and we talk about these things, are we sort of, glossing things over, conflating, and not being, precise enough?
I think it's both to do both. I think it's best to do both, meaning to look for ways we can find commonality, because there's power in numbers, and there is health and safety in identifying things that we have in common. That's just smart. That's just smart politics. But also in that process, we have to always respect individuality. I understand why Puerto Ricans say I'm Boricua and not Black, because they're from an individualized culture that has their own history, culture, food, etc. I'm fine with that. And so it's best, I think, simply to do both, to identify ways and means of commonality, but also to be proud of, to know your own individualized histories as well. And this book, the best friend of Set, the Vitiligo twin, is a young Polish kid named Bogdan. And they have a really interesting relationship, at least early on. It turns when they become men, which is very complicated, but in their friendship, they have really interesting, frank discussions about race. And as I said before, for me, fiction is a repository for possibilities. It's so important that for people who are different to engage in real talk, what I would call real talk about race, because we cannot move forward unless we have a real talk. And I get, race is an awkward situation.